Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am so excited to be here today. As many of you know, the 1455 Literary Festival this year, we opened up the umbrella to be more all-encompassing of all things storytelling. And as soon as I got word on that, I jumped at the chance to interview two of my personal favorites about the fashion realm and the stories that we tell through the clothes that we wear. And that extends to royals and politicians and everyday people. And so I want to introduce our lovely guests, and then we will get right to it. So Robin Devon is from the Washington Post, and she's a senior critic at large, writing about politics, race, and the arts. Previously, she covered the fashion industry as a business, as a cultural institution, and as pure pleasure, which I think we can all relate to. She is, importantly, the 2006 Pulitzer Prize winner for criticism and the author of The Battle of Versailles, the night American fashion stumbled into the spotlight and made history, which is a fantastic read. In addition to the Post, Robin has worked at Newsweek, Daily Beast, Vogue magazine, and the Detroit Free Press. During her most recent tenure at the Post, in addition to fashion, Robin also covered Michelle Obama during the first year of the administration. We are also joined by Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, HRH, So Many Thoughts on Royal Fashion, another instant classic for the bookshelf. She spent more than a decade on staff at the Wall Street Journal, covering the business and messaging of fashion. Since leaving the paper, her work has appeared in a host of national outlets, including the New York Times, InStyle, and Elle. Elizabeth is a contributing editor at Town & Country magazine and has gained acclaim for her Webby-honored Instagram stories series, So Many Thoughts, and which is a perfect segue into this discussion because I have so many thoughts about fashion and storytelling. And just to jump right in, I would love to hear from you both because what I'm really excited about this conversation is that you two both not only have a fashion background in the fashion space, but are also traditional journalists as well as not so traditional journalists. And I think that the Venn diagram of storytelling is with those two buckets is one that I'm endlessly fascinated with. And so I would love to hear from you both, how did you get into journalism and specifically into the fashion space? Robin, let's start with you.
Well, I started out in journalism because I loved writing. And like a lot of people, I think, I didn't really have a particular area that I wanted to specialize in. But with my first job being a generalist, I happened to be in a department that was filled with people who specialized because it was the entertainment section. So it was the section of critics. And I didn't have a beat. And I joked that I sort of got the backwash of everyone else's beat. And it was purely circumstances. The fashion editor at the time became a columnist. They needed to fill the position. This was at the Detroit Free Press. At a time when all of these regional newspapers really had an incredible emphasis on fashion. I mean, it was a beat that, they covered full bore. They sent their fashion editor to Europe and to New York to cover the collections. And so they were looking for a replacement, and I raised my hand because I thought it could be interesting, but mostly because it was a beat. And I started out covering menswear part-time. That was my entree into the fashion world. And I would say that it was a really great way to enter because menswear was a smaller part of the industry. It didn't change as rapidly as the women's division did. And there was also a kind of gratitude and excitement when a reporter would call up a menswear company or a menswear designer and say, I'd like to write a story about you, contrary to what the women's side was at that time, which was, oh God, another person? No, you really, we have no use for you.
I love it. I love it. And Elizabeth, how about you?
Sort of the same. Like I did not set out to cover fashion. I worked in local news in the Midwest for a couple of years and covered school assemblies and the crime beat and some things for a smaller local paper there. And I had gone to journalism school in New York and was always hoping to get back. And the Wall Street Journal had an opening and for a reporting assistant. And, I said, I will pour coffee. Like, I will do whatever you need. Like, please just like, let me in the door. And so I did sort of take a step back. I became a reporting assistant at the Journal. But it was a great experience to my first sort of national newspaper because just being in the newsroom, being surrounded by talented colleagues and editors was fascinating. And I covered a bunch of different things at the Journal, sort of on my spare side, whatever somebody didn't want to cover, I would sort of jump in. And then in 2008, I actually moved to DC for the paper and I covered the presidential campaign, which was a real sort of way of life, less than a job, more a life, to live on the campaign trail. And when that was over, I wanted to go back to New York again. New York was always sort of a pull for me. And I said, like, what do you got for me? Like, what can I write? And they're like, we had this opening on the retail beat. Like, would you like to cover retail? And I was like, I'm not sure. And they're like, we're not asking. I was like, great. I would love to cover retail. That would be amazing. So I joined the corporate desk and I covered apparel makers. And that was a very sort of Wall Street Journal introduction to the fashion industry because, it was talking about the supply chain and earnings reports and like really the business of fashion. And I think that was sort of a great foundation for the coverage that I went on to do. And then I moved on to the feature desk and became a style reporter.
Excellent. Excellent. And thinking more personally, what is each of you, what is your earliest sort of fashion memory that you have from childhood, from your professional career? It doesn't have to be the earliest, but just an early memory of yours where you fashion sort of you got bit by the bug.
Well, I don't know that I was ever really bitten by the fashion bug, so to speak. I have an early childhood memory of being obsessed with a pair of white go-go boots when I was about, 5 or 6 years old. There's a period of time of like family photos that lasts for about 7 or 8 months in which I am always wearing these boots. I wore them to bed. I mean, there's a point at which you sort of go, did you not have any other shoes? And but so I guess maybe embedded like deep in my brain there was this love for fashion. But I have always felt like I was kind of standing in the doorway of the fashion industry. And periodically I sort of saunter into the deep end. But I always feel like I'm really tethered to the world of journalism. And those are my people. Those are the people that I want to have the conversations with. And the fashion industry is what I cover. And I think in some ways that is what differentiates a lot of newspaper or general interest coverage of the fashion industry from industry coverage. When I went to Vogue, one of the first things I realized, which probably should have been obvious, was that, a fashion magazine is part of the fashion industry. And it is part of its job is to tell the story of the fashion industry in a way that perhaps occasionally offers a bit of tough love, but is fundamentally a place that cheerleads and celebrates and supports the fashion industry. And I think, for me, general interest publications are cheerleading for the consumer, for the sometimes perhaps slightly disenfranchised from the fashion industry, or the people who are estranged from the fashion industry, or the people who would really love to be embraced by the fashion industry, but have some hesitation about, jumping in whole hog. So, I mean, I think in some ways, the fact that I didn't really have this epiphany of fashion love is what has helped me in my coverage of the industry.
I love that, Robin. I feel the same way. I didn't sort of aspire to move to New York and intern at a women's magazine. I always liked shopping. My earliest memory of like wanting something was in 6th grade, and my best friend Becky, her mom was taking her to the mall, to the Limited, to buy a V-neck shirt. And I was like, Mom, we have to go to the mall to the Limited to buy a V-neck shirt. And she's like, well, why do you want this shirt? And I was like, well, it's from the Limited. And it was just this idea of like the brand, it was just a t-shirt. And my mom was like, no, like we're not doing that. But I like coveted this t-shirt, and I like saved up my money, and I was able to get it eventually. And then I wore it all the time. And I remember the feeling of a V-neck and being like a little bit more exposed. I was in 6th grade. It was like very early days of like realizing who I was. And my mom was never into fashion, but she was always into sort of presentation. We got dressed up for church on Sundays, and she was very aware of like how we looked, and we put our hair in bows and things like that. And so I was very cognizant of that kind of thing. What I appreciated at the Journal was a lot like what Robin said, which is that we weren't embedded in the fashion industry. And in a lot of ways at the Journal, I had to sort of fight. I mean, this was a long time ago. The fashion coverage there is really robust now, but like people were still sort of like, oh, fashion. And I was like, well, you wake up every day and get dressed, right? You shop for clothes. Everybody shops for clothes. Like, I think it is a very sort of universal experience, and the choices that you say or that you make say a lot about you. And so I do think it like touches everybody in a certain way, and how much you care about it. Obviously varies tremendously. But I've never thought of myself as like a fashion girl. Like I really enjoy watching it sort of unfold. Like I loved going to Fashion Week and seeing sort of the peacocking that happens there. And I have a great respect and admiration for all the work that goes into it. But it's fun to sort of watch it from like a step back, I think.
And just kind of like jumping on that. I mean, I think one of the things that is to me important about when you cover fashion is that you maintain a capacity to be shocked and dismayed, because there's so many things I think that happen in the fashion industry that are part of just sort of the general nature of the industry, that it's really easy to just, and it probably happens on a lot of different beats, but it's very easy to start just sort of thinking of those things as normal, and they don't surprise you anymore. And I find it's just really helpful being in an environment where I'm constantly having conversations with colleagues who are not covering the fashion industry, and I tell them about something that's happening or something that's coming up, and to hear their surprise and the questions that they ask. I mean, it's just like a constant reminder that, what seems normal about this industry is not necessarily normal to the average person. And it's important to be able to remember that and connect with the average person. I mean, every single season, I would get an email or two from someone who just was frustrated that the models were not smiling on the runway. This is just like the classic question, like, why are they so unhappy on the runway?
That's so great. I remember thinking early on when I was covering retail, it was like the Gap was struggling, which the Gap has been struggling for a long time, but they would put forth all this stuff. And at the end of the day, I was always asking executives like, but how are you going to win over shoppers, right? Like this is a game where you have to win over people. And the consumer base for fashion and clothes is huge. I mean, it's everybody. And so I appreciated the companies that were thinking about shoppers, that were thinking about how to entice people and how to position their things. And listen, fashion is also art, and that is an incredible part of it. But I was always sort of interested in how it trickles down to, the rest of us.
Definitely. You know, I fancy myself a recovering journalist. I spent about a decade at USA Today and Gannett, and I worked in the travel and then entertainment departments, but I had the privilege of attending several fashion weeks, and as someone who did not cover that and would jump in to cover runway shows, it was very eye-opening for me because I would see a lot of that behind the scenes, and that I remember the realization, probably my very first fashion week, of these clothes going down the runway are not the same clothes that are necessarily going to be hanging on hangers in stores. And there's that that storytelling that the designer is doing, and their show is a story. And that to me was something I just thought, okay, Fashion Week, it's just, these are the different pieces that were designed. We're going to send them down the runway on various models, and that will be it. The magazines will all be sitting front row. And it was very eye-opening to me to see how there's a story to it, and that the most successful and really the only successful shows are the ones that do tell those stories. But then recognizing that there's a secondary story that then gets told by the consumer and how they interpret it. And of course, in the middle, there's the marketing and the retail piece of that, and how it gets translated for the consumer, and then how the consumer then takes it and makes it their own, right? So something that I would love to know from you both is when you hear the term storytelling, what is it that you think about? What comes to mind?
I mean, my mind almost automatically goes to the consumer, because you know, the pleasure of writing about fashion is that even the person who is aggressively, vocally anti-fashion is still reacting to the industry. And, you know, they're having perhaps a negative reaction, but they're still reacting. And to me, that is all part of the story that they're telling about themselves. You know, the person who is so vehemently anti-fashion, you know, often is the person who wants to be thought of as, you know, resolutely serious about, you know, their daily pursuits. Or it's someone who likes to think of themselves as an eccentric who doesn't follow trends, or someone who believes that you know, fashion is frivolous and it's you know, entirely too superficial. And I think all of those things are a way of that person communicating how they want to be seen publicly. And, you know, that, to me, that is the wonderful storytelling nature of fashion. And also the way that it's perceived culturally, I think tells us a lot about who we are as a culture. The fact that, you know, it's often perceived as superficial and frivolous, despite the fact that it's a global trillion-dollar industry that impacts everyone, to me says a lot about the way in which, you know, it's sort of assumed customers are. Who those assumed customers are, and they're assumed to be women. And to me, you know, the whole, you know, the very gendered nature of fashion says a lot about how our culture is very sexist and often demeans the pursuits and avocations that are typically associated with women. And, you know, one of my favorite comparisons is that, you know, deep and profound meaning is put into you know, the college basketball brackets, because basketball and sports is perceived to be the pursuit of men. Men can go on and on about expensive watches and cigars and fast cars, but, you know, women are often especially professional women are often incredibly hesitant to have a conversation about makeup or shoes, even if it's something that they love, because they don't want to be judged negatively. And the reality is that they probably will be judged negatively when in fact they shouldn't be, because it's simply another pursuit. And the fact that you have, one brain cell that is given over to great shoes does not reduce your IQ or make you any less of a professional. So I think that is another story that fashion tells. And it tells us a lot about race, and it tells us a lot about beauty and how and who we value and why we value those people. So I think it's a lens that is just incredibly wide, and it also has the capacity to sort of be a magnifying glass as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think in our hyper visual culture right now with social media and, cable news, you can't sort of overstate the importance of what someone's wearing, right? When you're a public figure of any kind, because, and I focused a lot on the royals, but I think anytime anybody, especially women, step out and you see a picture of them on Instagram or on the news, suddenly the first thing you see oftentimes is what they're wearing. And like that's just a fact. I remember I started my career in television news for like a hot second, and I was on air, my first live shot, and I thought I did so well. And I finished the spot, and I got off and my phone rang, and it was the news director, and he was like, "You look awful." And I was like, "Whoa." I was like, "I just did my first live shot." I was like 22, and he was like, "People are not going to listen to what you're saying if they don't like the way you look." And it was like this very harsh lesson, but I was like, that really stuck with me. And I think that's true for a lot of us in a lot of ways, because the minute you see something, if somebody's, wearing something that's either bright and catches your eye, that's an opportunity. If somebody's wearing something that's really somber, that's an opportunity. And so with public figures especially, but I think with all of us, because we're just in this visual moment right now, what people are wearing sends a real message. And so when I think of storytelling, I think a lot about that. And I think a lot about, the ways in which we present ourselves. And especially in the royal world, these women, my argument is that they don't really have that many opportunities to speak publicly, but what they do is they step out and they, to great fanfare, and they're highly photographed, and those photographs go around the world in seconds, and it's a real opportunity. So I think it's what Robin was saying about, our sexist culture. It's so true, right? We need to have a broader conversation about why this burden of appearance is placed on women, much more so than men. But I do think that it can also be an opportunity to sort of craft a visual brand, and that I think a lot of people do really well today.
And I think men, particularly in politics, are acutely aware of how powerful their public image can be. I during the last presidential campaign, I was a little bit obsessed with President Biden's pocket square, to the degree that I completely pestered a stylist friend of mine. I kept texting every time like this pocket square appeared. And, it's such a subtle thing, but he wears it not all the time, but very often. And it's this perfect trifold pocket square. And to me, it was really symbolic of a kind of formality, but also a civility and a real care with detail. It was a little bit old-fashioned, but not stodgy. It was, as I said, quite formal. And in so many ways, I thought that was, just a very sort of subtle way of saying that through his appearance, that he was a different animal from the previous president. And, and I think that carried through. And if you looked at the previous president, he had a very particular way of dressing that kind of underscored his almost sort of loose cannon way of governing. And, I think all of those things come into play when you look at, the congressman, and you look at someone like Representative Jim Jordan from Ohio, who is known for not wearing a suit jacket when he's in Congress and when he's sitting on a committee and questioning witnesses. And it's a very sort of pugilistic way of dressing. And he has said that, he doesn't wear a suit jacket because, he feels like it's almost inhibiting his ability to sort of fight with the witnesses that are in front of him. And it's also a nod to this kind of shirt sleeve, informal, regular guy sort of persona that he cultivates. So, I sort of think that the stories that men tell with their clothing should be talked about more because they're there. And we do spend more time, as Elizabeth said, talking about the stories that women tell with their clothes. But there's a lot of room, I think, for the men's coverage as well.
I love what you said though, Robin, about the pocket square, because it's those small things that can make you feel something, right? Like you might not even realize it as a viewer, but you see something that you can either connect with or you like hone in on. And if you see it consistently, and that's the power of fashion right there. If you think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her legacy, people showed up to mourn her in collars, right? Like that's such a powerful thing that she had a signature look that people could then pay tribute to her with it. And so I do think that coming up with a uniform, I live here in Silicon Valley, and like the uniform is king for a lot of these, and it's very relaxed and it's very intentional, sneakers and a hoodie and things like that. And I think all those are choices that people make, both men and women, and they send a message, and they make you as the viewer feel something.
Absolutely. And my fangirl will be showing a little bit here, Robin, but to build on some of those points, one of the pieces that you wrote in the past year that really stuck with me was the pocket squares and pearls from January. And on that very same, because that I tend to read into every little detail about what someone is wearing. And I'm sure that it has something to do with just my love of fashion and of the stories that I think, making meaning out of everything, sometimes to a fault. But I loved how in that piece, I have it written down here, the way that you described the pocket square as a way of decorously grabbing attention without ever raising your voice. And I just love that so much, because I do think that is what I loved about the pocket square and pearls piece, was the sort of the comparison of the Harris and Biden and the pieces that they wear and the accessories that they wear, and looking at the aviators and the Converse sneakers. And that alone got me a little bit fired up on the gender front, just thinking, I love the aviators and I love the Converse sneakers, but thinking about how as a culture and even globally, it's reflected. And I thought, if Harris were known for her sunglasses, it would be, I think, sort of the commentary around that would be, there'd be a lot of pushback and it'd be this frivolous thing. I mean, you can see it even with the Converse sneakers. Sometimes there's a lot more pushback on how casual that is versus Biden just rocking these, manly Tom Cruise inspiring aviator sunglasses. And I think that's, I loved it, because in that piece, you very much talked about how the individual stories that they tell through these really little details that are very, a lot of thought goes into them, whether people always perceive that or not, and how even the harmony of the two working together. And I think that's really powerful.
Well, thank you so much. And, one of the interesting things about the Converse sneakers is, she was wearing them when she was photographed for the cover of Vogue. And I know I was really kind of taken aback by the way that so many people responded to that cover, and they responded negatively because they felt that she was too casual and that it wasn't one of those sort of stately, regal portraits on the cover. And it just sort of drove home again for me, the very almost tortured relationship that sometimes women have to contend with when it comes to fashion, and how, it's so interesting because there are so many layers to unpack. There's so many meanings there. And, and the context matters so much. The same ensemble, on the cover of Essence magazine, for instance, may not have created such a stir, but the context of Vogue, it means something else. And I was really struck by the sense that it was not respectful enough when theoretically what Vogue was going for was a kind of celebration of someone who was not full of stuffy formality and was not about titles, but was coming in to kind of roll up her sleeves and do the work. And that's arguably, a perfectly lovely message. So, I mean, all of those conflicting storylines I found fascinating.
Mm-hmm. So to back out a little bit, another one I think that I did gush a little bit in my email to you about this panel was a piece that you wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, March 16th, 2020 to be exact, on the sort of pandemic dressing. And before I even realized that it was something I was doing last year, your piece became one of the first items that I stuck in what is now my time capsule of 2020.
The last year.
And it's wild. I think part of me, I don't know if it's the contrarian in me or the nonconformist, but I think it's some of my motivation for putting together this time capsule was about the whole notion of it being this last year. And I have just stacks and stacks of newspapers. So much happened last year.
Yeah.
And I don't want any of that to get lost. And something that this is a piece that you wrote, the headline that was in the post. And this was, mind you, just a few days into lockdown. I don't even know that we were technically in lockdown. I don't think we were using that word yet. And the headline was, "Our clothes tell our story. What happens when the narrative is just pajamas and sweats?" And for me, this was something that I think the whole work from home bit of the early pandemic transition for people, for me personally, was a very big mirror, because I had been working from home by that point, probably a little over 2 years. And I remember reading this and thinking that it just completely encapsulated how I felt about working from home. And I hadn't fully been able to articulate it, even, over the course of those 2 years. And there's a piece in here a line where you say, "An essential part of our identity is rooted in how we relate to the people around us, how we situate ourselves within the social hierarchy. We are defined in part by our tribe. We dress to tell a story about ourselves. And if there is no one to hear our narrative, we've been put on mute." And I remember thinking, that sort of just punched me in the gut. And I remember, I think I responded to your tweet about it within, as soon as I'd read the piece, and it just completely summed up what the last couple of years of my professional life had been, and really not fully appreciating when I left my previous job to start working for myself. And I hadn't realized how much of my identity was tied up in both my career, but also in what I wore to work, and sort of how I presented myself. And I think last year there was a lot of, how do you behave? How do you dress? How do you do all of the things when there's no one around to watch, and when there's no one to see it? And there's something that I'm very fascinated in, and you talk a lot about how our clothes create boundaries and how they mark time. And I think that from a fashion standpoint, a lot of us probably would consider 2020 a lost year. And I've been likening 2020 to almost like an elimination diet. There was something was terribly wrong with most of our societies and our systems and our culture, and everything got taken away right up front. Everything was stripped down, and we now have this almost unique, at least from a historical standpoint, opportunity to start putting back a little of that. And I've been thinking about it from the standpoint of socialization, and things that I'm doing with friends or not doing with friends, and different people that I'm inviting back into my life. And so we're able to do that in bits and pieces. And I think the fashion piece of it is also really fascinating. And the Wall Street Journal had a big piece recently that got a lot of buzz about the joy dressing, and that sort of being this trend going into everyone's reentry is wearing colors and really putting your personality out there. And I'm curious from you all, both a reflection of 2020 and you know, whether personally or on a broader level, you know, what that meant for fashion and style from your point of view, but then also what are you seeing going forward?
Yeah, I went through a similar thing, Rebecca, when I left the Wall Street Journal and moved from New York to California. And I remember I unpacked my closet and it was just like black dresses. And I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense because I'm working from home. Like, I don't need a dress. Like, I had young kids. And it was this like, who am I and why do I get dressed? And, you know, if I'm just sort of living in my own little bubble here and not, you know, going to an office every day, like, what does that mean? And I did appreciate when lockdown hit and people were like, whoa, work from home. It's so weird. Like, what do you do? What do you wear? Like, I miss my clothes kind of thing. And I totally agree that it's an opportunity now to like step back out into the world and make really thoughtful choices with what you're wearing and to have fun with it. I mean, at the end of the day, fashion can be so fun. And I think it can be a real mood lift, and it's fun to see people in their like head to toe looks. When I think of pandemic fashion, though, I think a lot about like how people maximize like a shoulders up look. Like, you know, I loved those like snapshots where people are like, you know, like professional from the waist up and then like wearing shorts or sweatpants or things like that. I found that really funny. And, you know, just certain accessories that really popped, like headbands were super popular. And I think it's because they're just a very visible, you know, Zoom accessory to have. I hope that like, not just in fashion, but with all of life, that we step back into the world with, you know, thought and intention. And I think the way we shop and, you know, the brands that we choose, and, you know, there's a real opportunity here. But I love this idea of dressing for fun, for joy. I think that's what should be at the heart of fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by just in looking at some of the upcoming collections, just how much color there was and how much and how delightful they really were. You know, and how some of them also kind of tapped into the a desire to be kind of a corrective for you know, things that have been overlooked in the past. I mean, I think in part because the Pierre Moss couture show is still sort of fresh in my mind. You know, I was thinking about that collection that was inspired by Black inventors who a lot of people may never have known about. And just being able to kind of tell that story, you know, regardless of whether you like or dislike the clothes, you know, I just think that it's an opportunity to for people to really rethink where they go for their clothes, how they shop, what they want their clothes to mean, whether or not they are more sort of socially aware of the, you know, the circumstances of their production. But, you know, I guess also there's the journalist in me who that's a little bit skeptical. And I think that people are terrible creatures of habit. And, you know, I remember one of the early stories I wrote was about how all these fashion companies were having these long Zoom sessions in which they were having a come to Jesus conversation about the amount of merchandise they were producing and how quickly the cycle was going and how everyone felt like they were hamsters on a wheel, sort of spinning out of control, and that, you know, the shutdown was an opportunity to reset, rethink about priorities, blah, 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 blah. And, you know, as soon as it seemed feasibly possible, we've gone back to, you know, shows, and people are already thinking about where they can travel to have one of those shows. I don't know that the amount of merchandise is being reduced by that much. So I think, you know, momentum is kind of hard it's hard not to kind of slide back into your old ways. But, you know, one thing that I keep hearing again and again and again is that people have gotten very used to being comfortable, of not trussing themselves up, about not wearing things that just fundamentally make them feel rotten. And I do think that there is a shift in what I've seen in different collections, which is there is an acknowledgement that no matter what the aesthetic, no matter how, capital F fashion it might be, I do think there is more of a recognition that it needs to be at least a nod to comfort.
Definitely. And I think as I was doing the prep for this panel, Elizabeth went back and reread the introduction to your book. And one thing that I was really struck by was that the very first
quote is Robin's.
Yeah.
Yes, it was so great. It was so, I loved talking to all my fashion journalist icons for this book, because I was like, you are so smart and so tuned into this. And Robin, you were so generous to let me interview you for the book. But yeah, no, it's true. And I think especially with royal women and royal fashion, there's like a very enthusiastic but also fraught conversation about fashion, and it certainly played out in the last year amid lockdown. And yeah, but no, Robin gave me a great interview for my book. Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
I love it. And then the quote for those of you watching at home is, what they are wearing is the way they make their statement. It's the way that they claim their place in history. And I love that. I think it goes along with this storytelling notion and the thinking about things through the lens of, even that historical perspective. And we'll get to the royals, but I think that there's a moment for us to, I know, Elizabeth, your work with so many thoughts has made me a lot more in tune to not only dissecting and thinking all the thoughts about what I see others wear, but also what I wear myself, and thinking about, Robin, to your point about, thinking more about where it came from and how it was made, and the story that it tells. There may be no audience there for that, but for other than me personally, there's one of my most cherished possessions I dug out. I went to New York in March 2011 with my mom to shop for my wedding dress. And of course, we were leading up to our first big royal wedding of this generation. But I saw the Nora Ephron Love, Loss, and What I Wore. Just unbelievable monologue driven show on Broadway. And I loved it so much because that was sort of my first glimpse of, okay, these are the things that when I wear this, and it's not even always the thought up front, but the thought looking back on, this is what I wore when I got engaged, or this is what I wore when I made that big presentation, and really having the love and the respect for what it is that I was wearing in those moments, and what a big part those moments play, which gives me a little bit of agita when I think about the royals in this sense, because Elizabeth, you have a quote in your book that says, if you think getting dressed in the morning is a challenge, consider what these women face. And that just gives me a little bit of a panic.
No, I think it's true. So I was always sort of had an eye on the royals, because back in 2011 I got married and Kate and Will got married, and I was sort of like, what's going on and who is this person? And I kind of did sort of swoon over the moment there. And then certainly, understanding the ways in which royal women get dressed and have for a very long time, and the important parts that clothing plays in their public persona. People ask me all the time, like, you'll get an occasional shot of Meghan or Kate like off duty, like a paparazzi shot, and they're like, why don't you weigh in on that? I'm like, those are interesting, and I think that represent their personal style. But what I am very interested in most is when they step out for public consumption, because that's such a big part of their job. And my book starts with the Queen, because I think, for modern royals, she certainly laid the groundwork for this. And she's not somebody who I would say is inherently interested in fashion, but she understands clothes and the importance of clothes and has crafted a really sort of admirable and specific uniform. And Robin, this was a point you made that I put in my book too, that there's this sense of calm that comes from that consistency. You know, you can close your eyes and picture what the queen is going to look like. And then along came Princess Diana, and she brought this level of excitement to royal fashion that people hadn't seen before. And the conversation around her clothes and how much it was part of her story and how photographed she was from the very start. And then into the modern day royals with Kate and Meghan, you know, I mean, what they wear, I think there's sort of no American sort of counterpart aside from perhaps a first lady moment where people get so excited that they want to shop it. You know, I mean, celebrities wear stuff and like they drive, I think, purchasing power, but there's something about the royals that people want, that they want to buy that. And so it's a tremendous sort of economic power that they hold too, the ability to put a brand on the map. You know, if they wear, you know, J. Crew, things sell out really quickly. And I find that whole discussion around not just fashion, but sort of the power of fashion and the brand and the sort of excitement around it, I find that endlessly fascinating.
Can I ask Elizabeth a question?
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh.
I am so fascinated by Meghan Markle's shift from the world of celebrity presentation, public presentation, to the world of royal presentation. And I'm just curious in the ways in which sort of the storytelling differs when you are a celebrity stepping out on a red carpet versus when you are now the Duchess of Sussex stepping out. Well, I don't know. Is she still the Dutch? Well, I forget.
She is. Yes. Yes. She very much is. Yes. Yes. Yes.
No. When she steps out, or certainly when they were still, you know, part of doing their royal duties and they were stepping out on the red carpet. I mean, how does the storytelling shift? Because I wondered if part of the challenge was simply that in many ways Meghan thought that understanding the world of celebrity presentation automatically gave her a certain understanding of what it meant to be like the ultimate celebrity, which is a royal.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And I think the difference between Meghan and Kate, there are a lot of differences between Meghan and Kate and Diana is, you know, Diana got engaged at 19. Kate started dating Will, you know, when she was in college. Meghan got engaged at 36. She had lived a full, accomplished life. She had worked with a stylist on the red carpet, costume designer on set. Like, she knew the language of clothes. And so I think she came to this with a real understanding of fashion. But I think the difference between sort of celebrity and royal is celebrities can just sort of like delight in clothes and fashion. They can show up on the red carpet and look fabulous. Nobody's like, how much did that cost? And I think with the British public, there are a host of unfair expectations placed on these women to fall into these narrow guardrails of what's acceptable. We want you to look, you know, like you're special enough to be a royal, but not so special that you're, you know, misusing our tax money kind of thing, even though that money doesn't go to pay for the clothes. And there is this expectation of, you know, how a royal woman should look and what she should wear. And certainly the pressures on that, you know, like when Kate joined the family and she was wearing these off the rack dresses, everyone was like, you're a commoner and you're just wearing, you know, like a $400 dress. Like, is that exciting? And it turned out it was. And then when Meghan joined and she had a much more fashion forward aesthetic from, you know, sort of the traditional royal look. And I think for the fashion world, I have never seen so much excitement. I mean, suddenly it was just like so many people who couldn't care less what Meghan or what Kate was wearing were like deeply invested in what Meghan was wearing. And I think she certainly broadened the fashion conversation. But I think that burden of the expectation, certainly of the British public, was extremely, extremely unfair and hard to face.
And Elizabeth, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the something that strikes me as a big difference, and especially as I've followed you over the years and so many thoughts and then read HRH, is the celebrities, a big part of social media, the social media age in particular, has given them this sort of, maybe it's not totally authentic, but this two-way communication with fans and with viewers. And when a celebrity wears something and there's all this chatter about what it means or what it could mean, they have the ability to say something if they disagree with how it's being perceived. They can kind of retake the narrative and kind of put it back on the track they want it to be on. Whereas my understanding of the royals is that, and I think you go into such great detail in the book with this, especially from a historical standpoint, that there aren't a lot of royal statements and press conferences, and sure they have social media, but you realize as you consume that it's behind many layers and walls. And so which is something that I do think makes royal fashion that much more interesting, is that the stories that they're telling through what they wear is so thoughtful, and every little detail is put into it. And the type of event and the audience, the parallels of storytelling to me are through royal fashion are just so striking. It's the audience they'll be around, it's the setting of where they will be, it's the plot of what it is that they'll be doing, and all of those things really feed into what they're wearing. And I can't even imagine what that process is, to the point about getting ready in the morning, the thought that has to go into that, and the multiple wardrobe changes throughout the day. But
logistically, it's a huge lift. And I think another thing that probably happened with Meghan is that she had access as a celebrity to a stylist and help and teams like that. And there's something in the royal world where people, it gets very small very quickly. I think people, it's a very grand family and they employ a bunch of people, but like Meghan was always said to style herself, and she certainly had help from some friends, I think. But just, it's a huge job, right? To dress thoughtfully and to dress for public consumption like that. And to know that you're going to step out, if you're on a royal tour. They went on that first royal tour, and I think it was like 36 outfits or something in the course of 16 days. Can you even imagine like what a job that is? Like, that's a whole job. And certainly the Queen has people that help her now, but like when you get lower in the hierarchy, like Kate has a pretty slim team. Meghan, I think had some help too, but it's work, right? Like this part of fashion is work, and it's really hard.
It also reminds me a lot of what like the first ladies go through. And, it's that difference between like the celebrity who is telling her own story or his own story, and then people like the first lady or the royal family who are in some ways kind of tasked with telling, for the first lady, the story of 320 million Americans, right? Like everyone has this vested interest in this representation, and the ability to please all of those people and tell their story accurately and exactly with all the nuance they want it, with which they want it to be told, is certainly, if not an impossible task, one that is, as you said, an incredibly heavy lift.
Yeah, and if you think about the first lady, she was just on the cover of Vogue, and she was wearing Oscar de la Renta, and then I think it was last week she stepped out in that dress again. And you'd have to be paying attention pretty carefully to sort of make that connection. But like, what a message to send, right? Like, I'm not just clammed up for the cover of Vogue. Like, this is a dress that I'm going to continue to wear, and that element of relatability that I think is placed on politicians, on first ladies, and certainly on the royal family, I think is an important part of it, because celebrities they have much more agency, right? They can talk for themselves more often. They can, make choices. They can have fun with it. Nobody's sort of keeping tabs on how much it all costs. But certainly with first ladies and with the royal family, it's a different equation.
And I know that we are unfortunately running out of time here. So I'll end on this question sort of along those lines. As we think about people, where the audience here today is very much focused or heavily weighted toward a literary audience. And, something that I would love to hear from both of you in closing is just, if you could impart something, advice, a tip that you would like to see people pay more attention to as it comes to what people wear and the messages that it sends, what would it be? Whether it's paying attention to royals, or whether it's getting ready yourself in the morning.
I always say two things on this question, because I think there's some pretty simple places to start. First is the brands that you wear, like where you shop really matters. You vote with your dollars, and the brands that you support. I think there is a chance now you can find out anything about any brand, right? If you Google it first. And so make sure you are supporting, brands that represent who you are. And that's not something that when you're out in the world, people are going to like automatically recognize what you're wearing. But you'll know. And I think you carry yourself a little bit differently. But even one step more obvious for consumption is the colors that you wear. I think that the colors that we all wear send a message about how we're feeling or what we're, where we're going. The royal women do that really well. They tend to dress in solid, very vibrant shades so they can be seen. But I think that, if you have a big moment at work and you're wearing a color that's important to you for some reason, that can be a little lift for you. And you're certainly going to project that, I think, to the people around you.
Yeah, and I would just say that, try to find sort of the poetry in your clothes. And by that I mean just, try and, look for pieces that give you a sense of joy or make you feel strong or make you feel tough or brave or whatever the thing is that you're grasping for on a particular day. I think we all sort of instinctively reach for, a particular garment that is reassuring when we have a particularly challenging day ahead. And I think if we can just sort of, people just sort of can tap into that kind of, emotional connection to their clothing, not in a maudlin or overwrought way, but just recognize that, your clothes have an impact on your mood. Then I think that will in many ways guide you towards what it is that you will want to wear.
Absolutely. I love that. Instead of dress for the job you want, dress for the mood that you're aiming for in that day.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. I'm so appreciative, Elizabeth, Robin, for your time and for sharing all of your wisdom here with our audience. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Bye.